Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're gonna talk about Kenny Rogers. So we all know that Kenny Rogers is very popular here in the Philippines, but it actually flopped in the US. And what's sad was that it actually gained a lot of momentum during its first few years. Like it was even on Seinfeld at one point, one of the highest rated sitcoms. But as fast as its rise, so was its decline. So of course, I got curious. Like it got me thinking, what's the story of Kenny Rogers Roasters? Why did it fail in the US and why is it thriving here? And who even is Kenny Rogers? Why did he decide to start a restaurant and why did it fail? If you're new here and if you're interested in learning about the origins of the biggest brands in the Philippines, then consider subscribing. My name is Chris. Welcome to Brand Origins. Okay, so Kenny Rogers. Now, it's kind of unfair to talk about Kenny Rogers Roasters without talking about the man with his name on the brand, Kenny Rogers. So Kenny Rogers sold more than 100 million records during his lifetime and is considered as one of the best-selling artists of all time. And funny because I knew that he was a top recording artist, but I didn't really know his songs. But every time I would search for him, the term The Gambler would keep showing up. And I was like, does he gamble? Is he known for gambling? Apparently, it's one of his hit songs. I can't add it here because I'll be demonetized, but just go look for it. It's one of those songs where you've probably already heard it, like especially in movies, but you just didn't know that Kenny Rogers was behind that song. And while you're at it, look for Lady and then Island in the Streams, the one he sang with Dolly Parton. Also had no idea that that was his song. Okay, so Kenneth Ray Rogers was born on August 1938. So Kenny Rogers was not born rich. His mom was a nurse's assistant and his dad was a carpenter. He said that he was the first person in his family to graduate high school. He mentioned that they were broke and that they lived in a federal housing unit, and then the most that his dad earned was around $75 per week. He also mentioned that although they were never hungry, like they had food to eat all the time, it wasn't necessarily the most nutritious that they could eat. Like he would only be eating peanut butter sandwiches like for days at a time. But he was a kid, so he never really had an idea of what he should be eating. So when he was around 11 years old, he won a talent show. So I guess this was like a window to his future career. And what's great about Kenny Rogers was that since they were poor, this guy was hustling. Like he worked as a busboy and he had this job where he was in charge of sweeping floors and making around $9 a week. And he felt that he needed to do this because he was the fourth of 8 children and his parents were already struggling. And so he just took any job that he could in order to support his parents and his siblings. But despite this, he always made time to work on what he actually enjoyed doing, which was to play with his guitar. So from Texas, he moved to LA and he started doing gigs. And basically what he did was that he just applied for any band. Like if they were lacking a member, he would go for it. So he kept hustling and hustling. And then when he was 19 years old, he already had a major hit. But then when sales dwindled down, he had to look for another band. He ended up joining the New Christy Minstrels. He was around 27 years old at this point. But then, Kenny wasn't really satisfied with the way they were playing. He wanted to do his own thing. And then so he started his own band called Kenny Rogers and the First Edition. And this was when things really started to pick up. Because several years later, they would rake in award after award from hit after hit. And at this point, Kenny Rogers was already killing it and he was like a star now. So here's an interesting tidbit. Apparently, over the course of his career, he was offered so many endorsement deals. Unsurprisingly, it's mostly from cigarette brands or alcohol brands, but he turned them all down because he didn't like the idea of endorsing alcohol brands. And this has a lot to do with his past. So apparently when he was young, his father was an alcoholic. And so one of the reasons why he couldn't support the family was because alcoholism really took a number on him and broke him. But then there was one endorsement deal that Kenny Rogers couldn't refuse. So there was this guy, David Murdoch, who was the CEO of Dole's parent company, and he was friends with Kenny. He tried his best to convince Kenny Rogers and offered him $17 million to endorse Dole. To give you some context on how big this was back then, Michael Jackson's deal with Pepsi was only around $5 million, and this was after his hit song Thriller was released. Of course, that's a drop in the bucket as to how much Michael Jackson earned from endorsement deals over the course of his lifetime, but still, this kind of gives you an idea of Kenny Rogers' popularity back then. So around 1990, Kenny Rogers started entertaining this idea of starting his own restaurant chain. And he was around 52 years old at this point. Now, I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but Kenny Rogers is listed only as the co-founder of Kenny Rogers Roasters. That's because he partnered up with John Y. Brown. John Y. Brown is instrumental to the story of Kenny Rogers Roasters. I'm not even sure if there would be this restaurant chain without him. Because whereas Kenny Rogers was the face of the brand, the star who was gonna draw in his audience because of his popularity, John Brown was there for the execution side of things. And this is why he partnered up with him, because he actually has an amazing story. Because John Brown was the one who acquired KFC from Colonel Sanders himself. I mean, I had no idea that KFC was even acquired from Colonel Sanders, but here's the story. So John Brown was a lawyer, and that's actually how they met, because Colonel Sanders asked him to be his lawyer, but he declined. So after they negotiated, I guess they started talking, and they ended up in the topic of fried chicken, of course, naturally. Just to give you some context, around that time, Colonel Sanders was already living a comfortable life. Like, KFC already had around 600 plus franchise locations at that point. But around that time, since he was already very old, his concern was about the future of KFC. Like, he was worried about what would happen to KFC when he dies. And around this time, he was already looking for buyers, and there were actually already a lot of them. And so what made John Brown interested was when he asked the Colonel. So he was like, oh wow, you have a lot of franchise locations. You must have an army of salesmen. And then the Colonel tells him that, oh, we don't have any. Like, he didn't like the idea of soliciting from investors. And so it made John Brown think. He was like, wow, you were able to achieve this without a sales force? Imagine what you can do with an army of salesmen. But before jumping into acquire KFC, John Brown agreed to run this other barbecue franchise that the Colonel planned on launching. And so he raised the money and started working on this. But then while running this chain, John Brown realized that although barbecue chicken was selling well, it was nothing compared to the nationwide and even global appeal of fried chicken. And so he raised the money from this other guy, Jack Macy, and he offered to acquire KFC from the Colonel. Colonel Sanders was hesitant at first, but then John Brown assured him that franchise owners would be treated fairly and then that the quality wouldn't be compromised. And so in 1964, John Brown acquired KFC from Colonel Harlan Sanders for $2 million. That's around $15 million today, or around 825 million pesos. Now here's the impressive part. So around 7 years later, John Brown grew KFC from 600 to 3,500 stores. And he would sell his stake for $284 million, which is around $2 billion today. That's a pretty massive return. So yeah, that's John Brown. And you can kind of see why this partnership made sense. So you have Kenny Rogers, who has built a loyal following and he can draw his fans in because of his music and popularity. And you have John Brown, who has operational expertise. I mean, you can see this business model today where you have a YouTuber or influencer who has gained a following in the millions. And because they have a lot of people paying attention to them, people who trust them, like let's say you have Heart Evangelista, Ann Curtis, the Kardashians, even Ryan Reynolds, they can launch any product they want. And even if that product isn't necessarily superior compared to what's out there in the market, because of the trust of their audience, it can immediately become successful. And so this was kind of the dynamic that they were going for. But then you're wondering, why this business specifically? Why rotisserie chicken? But that's because fried chicken was already so popular but then the competition was also intense. And so their idea was that, okay, let's not compete with fried chicken. What if we offered like the KFC of non-fried chicken? And so they were like, you know what? This might work because rotisserie chicken, it's healthier, it's already accepted by everyone because it tastes great, it's an affordable source of protein. I mean, that's why lechon manok, like our version of rotisserie chicken, is very popular here because it's cheap and it's healthy and it's tasty. I actually discussed that further in my other video about Chooks to Go, so go check that out. And they also mentioned that rotisserie travels well, meaning that if you take it home and if you just reheat it, it would still taste amazing. Like, it would still be juicy. Like, you know how there are some meals where if you don't eat them immediately while they're hot, they suddenly turn into trash? Like fries, if you don't eat them as soon as you get them, they suddenly morph into cardboard. And so that's why they went for rotisserie chicken. And so they launched in 1991. So when they launched Kenny Rogers Roasters, it was actually well received and it actually became quite popular. But because of its popularity, it also started to draw the attention of competitors, like almost immediately. So they launched around 1991, right? By 1992, they already had a lawsuit filed against them. It was by this other restaurant called Clucker's Wood Roasted Chicken. And the reason why they were sued is because I think Kenny Rogers Roasters was attaching themselves to the whole concept of wood roasted chicken. But eventually this was settled, but I'm guessing that they lost because Kenny Rogers had to acquire Cluckers. But this was just a sign of things to come in terms of competition. Because Cluckers wasn't the only competitor. There was this other brand called Boston Chicken. They're called Boston Market today. So around 1994, Kenny Rogers Roasters was pretty pumped about the future. Like, they had around 109 locations at this point. But then Boston Chicken had plans of opening 450 stores in 1994 alone. And that's not all. KFC also had their own rotisserie chicken product. They called it KFC Rotisserie Gold. And their budget for this was around $100 million. And aside from these restaurants, they also had another threat, which were supermarkets. Supermarkets were starting to realize that, oh, people love rotisserie chicken. we can do that too. So yeah, competition was starting to be so intense to the point that they named this whole thing as the Chicken Wars, where every popular brand kind of released their own rotisserie chicken product. I guess part 2 of this chicken war thing was the 2021 chicken sandwich wars between Popeyes, Chick-fil-A, KFC, and everyone else. Now, this chicken wars thing, it was actually pretty significant, especially for Kenny Rogers, and it was essentially what caused it to fade away in the US. Like, I read an article which said that in order to have survived that, they would need to have like a cash-rich backer, like a bank or a VC or someone who was willing to burn cash in order for them to make it. What's interesting was that when they appeared on Seinfeld, it was pretty much their last high note. I think their peak was around 350 locations and they just started to decline at that point. So Seinfeld was a super popular show and it ran from 1989 to 1998. The Kenny Rogers episode came out in 1996. 1998 was when Kenny Rogers Roasters would file for bankruptcy in the US. So when they filed for bankruptcy in 1998, they were acquired by Nathan's Famous. I think they have a branch here in BGC. And they were acquired for around $1.25 million, which is very low. Nathan's was kind of in a shopping spree that time. I think it's because of their strategy of co-branding. So unsurprisingly, when Nathan's acquired Kenny Rogers, they would close a bunch of its locations and would hold on to Kenny Rogers until 2008, which was when they would finally sell their stake to its current owners, the Malaysian mega company Berjaya. Okay, so this Berjaya company, they're so big. It's one of those companies where you have no idea that they exist, but you have probably interacted with products and services from brands that they own. So like they own and operate malls, they own an insurance company, they have hotels and resorts, they even have a stock brokerage firm. So even though Berjaya fully acquired Kenny Rogers in 2008, they actually already owned a piece of Kenny Rogers Roasters back in 1986 when John Brown sold his stake. Now Berjaya has a presence in Southeast Asia, but their home country is Malaysia. In the Philippines, they own the rights to distribute Mazda here. They also own this company, H.R. Owen. H.R. Owen is this chain of car dealerships in the UK, so they sell Ferrari, Aston Martin, Lamborghini, basically any supercar you can think of. That's why if you check their website, there are a couple of Ferraris on the front page. And funny because they own this brand called Jolly Bean, and their logo is using this font, which is suspiciously similar to that of Jollibee's. And I had to double check if Jollibee owns this brand, but apparently it was from Singapore. And unsurprisingly, when they opened here in the Philippines, they had to rebrand to Joy Bean. Now, another interesting thing that Berjaya owns, you see those lotto machines that they use? Berjaya owns a company that sells those. And in Malaysia, they're also the franchise holder for Krispy Kreme and Starbucks. So here in the Philippines, if Rustans owns the Starbucks franchise, in Malaysia, it's Berjaya. Now as for Kenny Rogers Roasters, as soon as Berjaya realized that the Southeast Asian market loved Kenny Rogers, they just pretty much closed all the US locations. The last US location of Kenny Rogers closed in 2011. And around that time, Berjaya was already making around $100 million from Kenny Rogers Roasters. But then, even though it failed in the US, why was it doing so well here? Why did it thrive here? They opened their first branch here in the Philippines in 1995 and they now have around 100 locations and they're planning to open 100 more in the next 5 years. So yeah, they're doing well here. One of the reasons why it thrived here was because of Filipinos' affinity towards Western brands. Like, you have to admit that as soon as we know that it's a foreign brand, we immediately give it plus points. Like, we perceive it positively. Like, we have a bias towards Western brands, especially American brands. And then there's the experience, the taste, and the price. Kenny Rogers embraced the whole fast casual concept. It didn't compete with the fast food concept of McDonald's and Jollibee, where you pretty much grab your food at the counter, eat it, and then go. Kenny Rogers' fast casual model made Filipinos feel like they were eating at a slightly elevated restaurant. I mean, compared to McDonald's and Jollibee. You wouldn't compare it to expensive restaurants here in Manila, but it kind of made you feel like you weren't eating fast food. Like, the whole concept of fast casual is you could dine in and take your time here at Kenny Rogers. Like, the atmosphere feels more inviting compared to other fast food restaurants. Because in fast food restaurants, you're not really expected to stay there for long. So like, Kenny Rogers Roasters became an option for when you're eating out with family. And you know, us Filipinos, we're all about family. So you can go there and not spend as much as you would when you would eat at higher end restaurants, but you would still end up feeling satisfied, like you ate a home cooked meal. So yeah, that's kind of the appeal of Kenny Rogers and why we still love it. But that's about it, guys. That's the story of Kenny Rogers. If you made it this far, please leave a comment, press the like button, and subscribe. It would really help YouTube push my videos to more people like you. I also make shorter clips on Instagram and TikTok, so go follow me there. The links are in the description. And I make threads on Twitter occasionally, so go check it out there. If you enjoy this, you might enjoy my other video about the history of S&R. I talk about the psychology as to how they arrange the items in their store, so go check that out. My name is Chris. See you in another video.